This week, we will be covering the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard, Sections 1 and 2. In the news, Ledger hardware wallets are vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. WordPress accidentally kills auto-updates in their latest auto-update. And Apple's iBoot source code accidentally gets leaked on GitHub. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. This episode is brought to you by IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. IT Pro TV offers an on-demand course library with more than 3,300 hours of content. Watch on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for Teams with a special offer for Security Weekly listeners. Visit itpro.tv/Security Weekly to start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off a standard or premium IT Pro TV membership using the code SECWeekly30.
Welcome, everyone, to Episode 5, our 6th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to be joined by my prolific co-host, Paul Asadorian. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Keith. It's awesome to be here. Love talking about application security issues. In fact, I have a call after the show to talk about application security issues. And I got some great insights with Signal Sciences last night, actually, Keith. So I'm kind of jazzed up. I feel like I have a little better understanding of what security looks like in today's new world of DevOps and containers. So a tiny, like a morsel that I was missing. So it's good.
We will get you there, Paul. We will get you there.
That's right. That's right.
So I was actually excited to see that Zane Lackey was on the show as well, and I actually got the queued up for my flight back from San Francisco later this morning. So I'm looking forward to catching up on that as well.
Oh, I had some, you definitely want to check out. Oh, I lost my notes, I think. Yeah, I definitely lost my notes. He said some pretty interesting things. He said security is a piece of the development process. And he said that developers should be security self-sufficient. So those were two very interesting points that Zane made, as well as we talked about the intersection of your containerization security platform and your application security platform. And he's like, you kind of need both, and they kind of meet in the middle, but they don't really overlap. And that was where I was questioning folks like Layered Insight, who's a sponsor of the show, and the other players in that space as well, and the other players like Signal Sciences to see like if there was overlap. The way Zane described it was they meet and don't overlap. And I'm like, oh, now that makes so much more sense to me. So that was my application security thought for the week.
Nice. Well, and so to the extent that he's right, and also I think that there's a lot more that has happened the last few years alone that has driven security into product lineups or functional code, for example, that the developers are almost wholly unaware of, but that's okay. So I really always go back to React.js as a front-end framework that does a whole lot for the developer to make them secure by default, and they don't have to think about it, right? So to the extent that there are tool sets today that are making that process seamless for the developer is awesome. Like it's one of the most exciting times to be in application security because we're actually killing whole classes of vulnerabilities by default, or at least we're trying to. So,
right. No, I like it. A couple of quick announcements. Make sure you check out some of our on-demand material at securityweekly.com/on-demand, which is awesome. Also, InfoSec World is happening March 19th through the 21st. You get a 15% off discount code OS18-SW. Make sure you attend that conference. Check us out. We'll be there. We'll have a booth. I'll be giving a talk along with several other really smart people. I can't talk this morning. I don't know what's going on. I'm not awake yet. I'm going to turn it back over to Keith.
Adrian Sanabria.
Adrian Sanabria. Yes. Spoke with Adrian yesterday. Great guy. Love Adrian.
Yeah. Awesome.
And most of the other people on this list too, Diana Kelly, Ed Moyle, Jennifer Manella, Mark Arnold, Matthias Madu, and Summer Fowler, we've all interviewed on the show. So
right. I mean, to the extent that if you want to get to know them a little bit before you go see their talk, listen to, Paul Security Weekly, our show for Matthias Madu a few weeks ago. I'm speaking there, which is going to be fun and exciting as well. I look forward to stopping by the booth and maybe doing some live recording of Application Security Weekly. So who knows? Maybe we'll do something crazy. But it's
we will have the ability to record. So we're talking about the OWASP. What are we talking about today? OWASP. This is the Application Security Verification Standard. Am I in the right episode? Didn't we talk about this last week? You want to talk about it more?
I do. And I do because I think that we covered it at a very high level, but I wanted to go down into the weeds just a little bit because I think that it's valuable to the listeners to continue on and say, okay, like I understand that this is a thing, but why does this matter to me? And part one of this, or the very first section of the standard, I felt was really valuable to some of the things that you were saying last week, Paul, which is we should have processes and technologies in place that make the process of development securely easier. And actually, in section 1 of the standard, it talks specifically about architecture, design, and threat modeling, which I think goes to the heart of what you were trying to get at last week, which is you have to think about what you want to build and how you want to build it before you build it. And that's kind of what they go into in section 1 here. So again, just at a high level for this standard, it's not a certifiable standard. It's not something that you can go out and get an OWASP ASVS like certified stamp, for example. But it is a kind of a nice standard from a broad overview of different things. Either if you're doing pen testing and you need some sort of model to pen test around or think about, if you're doing development and you need to think about how do we want to develop this thing securely. If you're writing tools to actually check for vulnerabilities, this will give you indications as to ways that you should go about looking for those vulnerabilities accordingly as a standard. And I like it a lot, especially because under section 1 for architecture, design, and threat modeling, they have those 3 levels that we talked about last week. So level 1, all components of the application are identified and have a reason for being in the application, right? Paul, how many times have you seen people just pull in, whole libraries of code where they only really needed a small piece of functionality, right? Like that happens a lot in my experience. What is it kind of your experience on your end? I know that you write some Python, and so I imagine you've probably done this a few times yourself.
I just import everything. That's how I roll. I'm like, I need a t-shirt like King of Imports. I'm like, yeah, I want it all. Yeah, I'm bad at that. I'm guilty for sure. Because then, I don't pull it. If I don't pull it all in, and then I'm using some piece of functionality, and then I got to go back and modify my import statement, and I don't have time for that.
You sound like a real developer already, Paul. You're already there.
I would not call myself a real developer. I am a developer wannabe.
So I would honestly say, though, one of those things that happens a lot, and to the extent that as security professionals, it's on us to say, I see you're importing the entire library here when all you're really using as functionality is random number generation, and you pulled in, all of math plus some, right? So to the extent that as a security professional, there's tooling that exists that will point out in the editor, like for myself, as I write code, it'll actually say you're not using like half of this functionality, or you're not using this import statement in any meaningful way. And it's like, okay, cool. I can actually start to identify as a developer before I even give it over to the security professional that all of the things that I'm doing make sense, or that they're actually used in the code, which is valuable. But then as the security professional going back and saying, look, you're using Java, for example, and you said import java.auth.star. What are you doing? Like, come on, there's like a small library here that you probably actually need, and you're importing all of the java.awt stuff. So I like that side of it, especially because it's like, look, write your code purposefully, but to the extent that and as you've seen, Paul, with Docker, we're trying to minimize the footprint of our applications, right? It's kind of like the rule of least privilege when it comes to a user on a desktop. The code should be a rule of least amount of code or least amount of functionality that is necessary to get the job done. Anything more is fluff and attack surface.
Well, and of course, there's performance repercussions to doing that as well, which on a small scale, isn't that big of a deal. However, if you're deploying an enterprise Java application, those Java libraries could be taking up precious resources that could cause performance issues down the road, especially at scale. And especially when we get into we're deploying thousands of containers, having a 50% larger memory footprint could be an issue if you've got 1,000 instances of applications out there. So performance is one of those things that obviously not really security related. Of course, it does reduce the attack surface, but those small, it's kind of like when when you do any kind of woodworking, like if you're off by like a little bit in the beginning, by the time you get to the end of the wall, it's like a 6-inch gap, in your molding or whatever you're building. Performance is the same kind of thing.
Well, and not to mention too, I imagine that more often than not today, what happens is people don't recognize that they're taking a performance hit because they're using the cloud, right?
Yeah.
They're saying, oh, we can just throw more computing resources at it. I would be really curious if a large company, right? So Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, what have you, if they went in and decided to start cleaning their code base to be lean, to be like as lean as possible, I wonder what their bill would look like at the end of the month from their cloud computing that they were otherwise using from a processing standpoint, and the reduction of that footprint overall.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I wonder, I know someone that I used to work for works for Cloud Checker. I want to say it's Cloud Checker. And they're basically, they analyze your footprint in the cloud and help you save money, right? And I like the approach to these companies because they're like, give us some money, we'll tell you how to save money in the cloud, and in the end, you should come out ahead, right? Like you've given less money to this company than you're going to save moving forward in your application. So I think that's awesome. I wonder how much you can benefit from reducing your security footprint with some of those tools, and use those tools in order to do that, gain performance and security benefits from it. Then it's an added return on investment for some of those other products.
And what's interesting is from a budgetary perspective, right, as a security professional, Cloud Checker, tools like that come out of the development budget, which, by the way, is probably a whole lot bigger than your security budget. So at the end of the day, that's also a kind of a win-win, right? Like you can convince your developer friends to say, hey, look, we can not only be more performant, but from my perspective, it also reduces attack surface.
Absolutely.
Why not? So the second part of this, or the level 2 adherence to this kind of core objective of the standard, is that an architecture has been defined and a code adheres to that architecture, which I think is interesting because more and more people are moving to like an API, like REST API model, or even like microservices sort of deployment, right? So I think that, Paul, you and I have talked about this on a number of occasions where even just building out a Docker swarm or a set of Docker containers to interact with one another in a specific way, having that kind of defined at the beginning and building your code to spec is incredibly valuable, not only from a time savings perspective, but also from a footprint perspective. I know that you've had some experiments with Docker as well. What are kind of your thoughts there?
Well, I think that's interesting, Keith, because that hasn't really changed over time, right? Like you've always had to have, you always should have had a solid architecture and design and spec that you're coding to build your software. To me, that hasn't changed, dude. Like that whole process is pretty much the same. We just have different Lego blocks to build stuff with, for lack of a better analogy. So I think that's just one of the fundamental aspects of building software today, whether it's a small project or a really large project. If you don't write a good spec, you're not going to have good software. And not good software could mean that it's insecure, it could mean that it performs poorly, or it doesn't meet the user requirements. So that's like building software basics 101 that I think just extends into the model that we have today.
And so I find it interesting as well with the startups today where they move fast and break things, right? So to the extent that I think DevOps is somewhat moving away from the idea of having a well-defined like long-term spec. So they're looking at the spec as in like, what's the next 10 feet of spec? And sometimes as a result of doing code that way, which is a very DevOps way of doing it, you miss the forest for the trees, right? Like you start walking down a path and you totally veer off, and what you wanted to get to was that other side of the forest, but what you ended up in is, in just kind of a U pattern back where you started.
You can still screw it up pretty bad. I don't know if you can screw it up. You can screw it up faster in DevOps, actually, is kind of what we were talking about last night with Zane, too. Like, you can screw things up faster. But even if you're just building a small piece of code to accomplish a very small task, you still go through the very similar process and try, at least, to think about, well, what do I want to do in the future with this? And so your architecture design could be how most of us start writing code, is just lay out a whole bunch of comments. Like, I want my code to do this, I want my code to do this, I want my code to do this. Keeping in mind where it might grow to in the future is the really hard part in that. And that's just something that it takes time. And, of course, it's a lot more difficult of a task when you move from, I'm just writing, Paul's little crappy Python script, to I'm deploying fleets of thousands of containers to deploy an enterprise application. So, yeah, that's a hard one, because you have to have a crystal ball almost to understand that.
Yeah, and building to scale is one of those really hard things to do, right? So to the extent that I'm working on a Python application now, and it's going to scale for me, scale to 1, right? But if I were building that same application to scale to 10 or 100 or 1,000 or even 1,000,000 people, the ways in which I would make function calls, the synchronous methods that I would otherwise use, or asynchronous methods that I might otherwise use, because of the fact that it has multiple users at the same time. I mean, web servers themselves, right? The idea that you can serve the same website out to hundreds of thousands or millions of people, or billions of people in some cases, and everyone has this kind of unique and individualized experience because of the asynchronous ways in which the functionality in the backend works, is very thoughtful and purposeful and difficult, right? Like, web servers are a pretty amazing thing as a piece of technology. And at the same time, you can see that in cases where they have vulnerabilities and they fall down, well, that's probably because there's now a new either problem of scale or a problem of use case that it's now trying to be, square peg, round hole into. So.
Yeah, and I enjoy designing software a lot more with containers. Like, and it took me a year to come around to that, but I really like that design model. It solves so many of those traditional problems that you've had before when you design an architecture. So in one sense, while you can screw things up faster, you can also recover from things faster, and change your architecture, maybe not in a huge way, but adapt your architecture over time to fit those needs. And I think that's why, going back to what you said, Keith, a lot of startups design for one aspect of the problem solving, and then evolve their architecture. And in some senses, that's bad, but the DevOps process actually allows for some of that to happen. Now, changing your architecture completely, that's when you start to run into trouble. So that right. I feel like there's a tipping point, right?
And kind of that event horizon experience where it's like, okay, we want to add this new integration or this new functionality, but your technology was never built to work that way.
Yeah.
And so it's the series of band-aids that you eventually run into, and then it just becomes a mess. I do want to talk a little bit about the section 2 of this as well, but in section 1, I think what's really nice is they actually have 1.1 through 1.11. We're not going to cover them, but it does have kind of small pieces that I think are really nice to think about. So, for example, the 1.10 was verify there is no sensitive business logic, secret keys, or other proprietary information in client-side code. Pretty straightforward and kind of thoughtful information, and you'd think that would be obvious, but maybe that's just because you and I see things with security glasses on, and everybody else says, I'll just put this hard-coded password here and we're good.
Well, and what Larry was talking about last night was not putting the business, not just secrets, but business logic in the user land code, or the code that the user's running or has any control over. And really that's based on, the best example is penetration testers when they test an e-commerce app and they're able to change prices, like from the user, like in the browser, changing fields, are able to change prices. And that's an architecture issue that has to be addressed before you write the code.
Right. And the other side of it too is, like, even if you have one of those problems where you can't click the submit button to actually like purchase something based on maybe a release time. So a good example is someone wants to go buy tickets to ShmooCon, and if ShmooCon had done this poorly, where it was some sort of like business or client side code that allowed me to now turn on that submit button, I could purchase tickets before anyone else could.
My favorites, and we saw a couple of examples of this. Larry's told me about some examples, I think Krebs described an example too, where basically I get paid to buy stuff. Like I end up with money and the stuff because I'm able to manipulate, the code. So I thought that was that's really bad. I think it's entertaining, but it's bad.
Yeah. So I do want to just touch on very briefly a little bit of the section 2, which is authentication verification requirements, which is huge, right? Like verifying a digital identity and the sender of that communication is incredibly important as everything moves to a web-based model, right? So
I have a question about this, Keith. We were actually talking about this yesterday. There's a lot of code and logic and consideration when you're implementing authentication if you're to do it yourself, right? You have to manage the credentials. If you want to implement two-factor, you have to build that into your process. You have to store these passwords. By implementing a Google authentication scheme where I can use my Google identity, so using an external identity provider, is that easy to do? Is that better? It depends on the use case. But does that alleviate a lot of the pressure off the developer to meet some of these requirements if they basically just say, we're going to trust your Google identity when you provide it to us? Is that better? Is that hard to code? I was trying to gauge that yesterday.
Sure. So hard to code depends on the application and where you're trying to put it, right? So if I'm building an internal only application and maybe it's in a sensitive network where I don't want it to talk to the internet, impossible, right? You can't use it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if I'm building an e-commerce website and I want people to be able to use their Google identity to log into the e-commerce website, that's actually really good for a lot of reasons. First of all, I don't have to worry about storing or encrypting passwords. That's like a huge number one there.
I don't want to have to worry about that.
Right. Well, so not only does it get me to deal with, like, I don't have to deal with the database in terms of storing or encrypting it. I don't have to deal with usernames. I don't have to deal with user enumeration problems. I don't have to deal with a whole series of problems that come about as a result of that. And so, yeah, to some extent, it actually is easier or better to allow for the use of like Facebook identification or Google identification or what have you.
Now, can you limit that to an organization? For example, if I have an internal application and I only want today the users within my G Suite account to have access to that, can I limit and restrict that pretty easily? Like
so
Slack
within
does
G Suite
that.
itself. Yeah. So G Suite is actually really interesting because you can do that same sort of thing where you create a document and you say, I want anyone with a at securityweekly.com email address to be able to access this document. And so, yeah, I mean, you can literally limit, it's not like role-based access control. I mean, you can have invitees that you can say, okay, only maybe like Keith and Sam and John can actually use this application or this spreadsheet, but everybody else can't. Like Mark and everybody else are like, no, sorry. Whereas for a lot of companies, what it ends up defaulting to is it's the at company address domain email. And so depending on the document, that may or may not be sensitive information that you really don't want shared out with everyone in your organization. But yeah, it's possible to do.
And you can do that on an application basis. Like I built a web app and I only want, in this case, Security Weekly users who are in my G Suite domain to be able to authenticate to it. Anyone else with a Google account is not able to authenticate to it. It's not valid. You have to be in my G Suite account to access it.
So what you would have to do at that point is you might have to do some sort of whitelisting technique internally. So you might say on this post request that has been returned, if it is the following like set of emails, go through the authentication scheme that Google has set up for us.
Yep.
Otherwise, just auto reject.
Gotcha.
So that's the sort of thing that you have to code for, and to some degree, you actually also have to code for very interesting scenarios based on timing attacks. So a really good example of this, and if anyone ever has questions on how to do this effectively, reach out to me, hoodie@securityweekly.com. So to that end, you can actually detect a user account exists based on timing, depending on how quickly the rejection of either email or login or what have you comes back. So for example, if I have an account that is, Keith@attackdriven.io, and that's my username, and I go to log in and I put in the wrong password. If I go back very quickly to say that this is a wrong password versus like actually check against a false sense of credentials, for example, I can time out the difference between whether it's a real account or not because of how quickly the database call happened, how quickly then it gets to a failure state from there, as opposed to if I never bother checking that database for anything at all.
Gotcha. I think in general, and I think what we're saying is in general, it's probably a good idea when you're looking at this OWASP guideline and it talks about authentication and credentials to start considering using some of these other methods of authentication. Now, at a high level, and I know we're timing-wise, we're probably getting ready to wrap this segment up. As a user, I don't really like using Facebook to authenticate to other things. I kind of feel vulnerable if I'm using my Facebook credentials to log into something else, because I don't know. It's just we can talk more about this too. I feel more comfortable using my Google account for that authentication piece. I think that the two-factor authentication is probably stronger in my Google account, although Facebook does support the YubiKey as well, so it does support a physical hardware token. I'm not sure if Facebook supports the Google Authenticator, but of course that's available in my Google account. I also feel like I have better tracking and monitoring of my Google account if there is abuse. I do, get emails that someone's logging in from somewhere else. I feel like I have more control over to say where my credentials are being used and how they're being used. I can log into the administrative interface and wipe stuff out if I want to. So I don't know. I like Google as an identity open identity. What was that called? I used to work with someone. Yeah, I used to work with someone that ran the Shibboleth project. I don't know if you ever heard of Shibboleth before.
I have. Yeah.
So,
so what's interesting too is some people are concerned about privacy for that, right? I don't want Google or Facebook to know that I'm logging into these web pages.
Yep.
And so that's a kind of whole nother side of the story. Right before we break for the news, I did want to cover one learning and tool this week because I thought this was actually really cool. Late breaking addition to the learning and tools section this week was in the Burp store. So for Burp Suite Pro, which is a application security testing tool, they just released a Burp App Store kind of plugin or module called Replicator. And what it does is it's designed to help developers reproduce the issues that were discovered by pen testers or security researchers like those that work at BugCrowd, for example, or provide findings on BugCrowd. And so the point of it is, as a person that uses a Replicator, you would load the file. Basically, that file is going to have all of the tests, the headers, the macros, et cetera, bundled into it from what I was actually doing to test your application. And it can now help you reproduce the finding. When you go and you fix it, run that replicator file again to see if it actually got fixed. And now it's like, cool, proof positive. I actually fixed it based on the way that this attack took place, and we're good.
You think this is better than Selenium?
Interestingly, Selenium is a much more developer-focused process, and I think that Selenium is a really great tool to leverage if you're talking to developers directly, because you're right, like Burp is probably not a tool that your developers are going to be using right now. So maybe this is a little bit of a ploy at trying to get developers to buy Burp Suite Pro, for example. But with that being said, I think that as a tool, if you can actually get this replicator file in a format that maybe it's cross-functional in Selenium, that'd be awesome. Otherwise, if you have maybe a application security engineer that works at your company that can work with your developers, like embedded inside of your developer organization to work with them and show them this information, it's a good kind of proof positive check from a human testing perspective, whereas Selenium is, I'm going to automate these things out into different playbooks, for example. And the developer probably doesn't know how to write that in terms of security testing perspective. Admittedly, I'm learning Selenium right now because I think that it is a really good tool if we can put some security processes around it.
I agree.
But
yeah,
admittedly,
it was recommended that we do
use it.
It was recommended we do Selenium with Jenkins to do automated testing of applications. So that's a topic I would like to explore a little more on the show. Me being the designer of our application in this case, I look at if I can have something like Selenium with Jenkins doing my testing. I want to build my security testing into that process as well. I don't want to have like a separate tool set to do security testing and a separate tool set for functional and QA testing. I want to build that all into one, and I want to have my attacks also be Selenium based as well.
That's probably a good point to actually just kind of bring it full circle is don't import more tools than you need to into your process.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Going back to our previous point, right? I saw that Burp Suite has a WordPress scanner. Have you checked this out yet?
Yes, I have. In fact, I think that I included that as well in the show notes. So they just added a WordPress application scanner inside of Burp Suite, which is quite awesome because I'm used to using WP Scan, which is a command line based. Whereas now it's like, great, I can actually go out and do some testing for WordPress vulnerabilities right through Burp Suite Pro, which as a security professional is where I live most of the time. So the number of places that I have found bad WordPress use cases and or just bad configurations is unbelievable. So this is going to be awesome for me. I can't wait to go bug hunting with this.
In my experience, Keith, both commercial and open source tools, my experience, don't have enough coverage of all the WordPress vulnerabilities to be a reliable tool. Like I struggle to find one source I can go to that can test for all of the vulnerabilities in plugins that are either known or unknown. WordFence is more of a protection tool. I haven't looked at it recently to see how it's going to evaluate my plugins and tell me if there's any vulnerabilities in it. Typically what I found in open source and even commercial tools is just the breadth of coverage just isn't there. Like I have to go to multiple tools to get enough coverage to understand my WordPress weaknesses.
So what this does is it actually does use the WP Scan vulnerability library. So those folks do actually keep a very up-to-date library of vulnerabilities as are discovered inside of WordPress, whether it's plugins or otherwise. Sure, there is always going to be more plugins to find vulnerabilities in, but as a team and as a project, they do a very good job of keeping that information up to date. So this plugin makes use of that. I don't think there's ever going to be 100% coverage for this because let's face it, people are making new and probably bad plugins every day.
To keep them on. Yeah, there are sites that you can subscribe to that'll scan. I can look it up for next show if you remind me. I may even have an account in one of them, but they'll automatically scan your WordPress instances. I think when I initially looked at it, it was a coverage issue. I wasn't overly impressed. Maybe they've gotten better. I want to say there might have been a free offering and a commercial offering for this service. It might have been from one of the other web app scanning vendors as well. So it's kind of interesting to keep up with your WordPress is really difficult from a scanning perspective.
Right.
But there's more tools. Well, we'll cover more tools next time because now that I think, we can do a learning and tools on that web one, and I can even put together some screenshots too.
Nice. And I was going to say, when we get to the news, we're actually going to talk about WordPress a little bit more. So with all that, stay tuned.